The thick manila envelope landed on my kitchen counter with a dull thud that seemed to echo through my empty house. My hands trembled as I read the return address: Sherman and Associates Law Firm. Of course Connor would use his cousin's practice to try to intimidate me. I'm Zoe, and this wasn't the first time my husband had tried to pressure me into signing away my inheritance, but it would definitely be the last. "Sweetheart, you're home early," Connor's voice carried from the foyer, smooth as honey but twice as sticky. I quickly slid the envelope into my laptop bag as he strode into the kitchen, loosening his tie. "Just needed to grab some files," I said, forcing a smile. "Heading back to the office soon." He crossed the space between us in 3 long strides, wrapping his arms around my waist. To anyone else, it might have looked loving. I knew better. "You've been working such long hours lately," he murmured into my hair. "I barely see you anymore." The Anderson account is keeping everyone busy. The lie came easily now. In reality, I'd been spending my evenings at the law library, secretly studying for my LSATs. My grandmother Evangeline's words echoed in my mind. "Knowledge is the one thing they can never take from you, dear heart." Connor's grip tightened slightly. "Speaking of accounts, did you get a chance to look over those papers I left for you?" "Which papers would those be?" I kept my voice light, though my heart was racing. "The inheritance transfer documents." His tone remained gentle, but I felt the steel beneath it. "It just makes sense to consolidate everything under our joint account. For tax purposes." I stepped away, busying myself with making coffee. "I'll look them over this weekend." "Zoe." The warning in his voice made me freeze. "We've discussed this. Your grandmother's estate needs proper management. You're brilliant at your marketing job, but financial planning isn't your strong suit." I gripped the coffee pot tighter, remembering the day 6 months ago when I'd discovered the truth. Connor hadn't just been managing my inheritance, he'd been systematically draining it through a series of clever manipulations that had taken me weeks of secret research to understand. "Actually," I turned to face him, "I was thinking of getting a second opinion. Maybe from Gillian?" The mention of his sister made Connor's jaw tighten. "My sister needs to focus on her own problems. Besides, she's not exactly qualified." "She's a certified financial advisor," I countered. "Who lost half her clients last year?" He stepped closer, placing his hands on my shoulders. "Baby, I know you're still grieving Evangeline, but she would want us to be smart about this, to secure our future." The irony of him invoking my grandmother's name made me want to scream. Evangeline had seen through Connor from the start. "That boy," she'd told me during one of our last conversations, "has hunger in his eyes, and not the kind that can ever be satisfied." "You're right," I said, meeting his gaze. "We should be smart about this." Relief flooded his features. He thought he'd won. "I'll review everything with a lawyer first," I added, "just to be thorough." His smile flickered. "We have lawyers, top-tier ones." "Your cousin's firm?" I shook my head. "I'd prefer someone independent." Connor's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Then it was gone, replaced by concerned disappointment. "I thought we trusted each other, Zoe. Isn't that what marriage is about?" The guilt that would have crushed me a year ago barely registered now. "Trust goes both ways, doesn't it?" He stared at me for a long moment before checking his watch. "We'll discuss this later. I have a dinner meeting." After he left, I pulled out the manila envelope and finally opened it. Inside was a formal notice of intent to file for conservatorship over my estate, claiming I was emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible following my grandmother's death. My hands weren't trembling anymore as I reached for my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized weeks ago. "Milo White's office," a receptionist answered. "This is Zoe Pearson. I need to schedule an appointment." I took a deep breath. "It's about contesting a conservatorship claim." "I can fit you in tomorrow at 9 a.m., she offered. "Perfect." I glanced at my laptop bag, where 6 months of meticulously gathered evidence waited. "Please tell Mr. White I'll be bringing documentation he'll want to see." After hanging up, I walked to my grandmother's portrait in the living room. "You were right, Evangeline," I whispered. "But you taught me well. And now it's time to show them exactly how well." "Girl, I knew something was off about him from day one, Zlata said, sliding a glass of wine across her kitchen counter to me. But this? This is some straight-up psychological thriller stuff. I'd just shown her the conservatorship papers, and her normally playful expression had hardened into something fierce. We'd been friends since college, but life, and Connor, had gradually pulled us apart over the years. I should have listened to you sooner, I admitted, taking a sip. And to Evangeline. Speaking of your grandmother, Zlata pulled out her phone. Remember this? She pulled up a photo from 3 years ago, my grandmother's last Christmas party. In it, Connor stood behind me, his hand possessively on my shoulder while Evangeline watched from her armchair, her eyes sharp and knowing. She cornered me that night, I said, the memory flooding back, after Connor went to network with some of her friends. Tell me everything. Zlata leaned forward, her bangles clinking against the counter. She said. I closed my eyes, hearing her voice as clearly as if she were still here. She said, that man collects people like others collect art. He displays them proudly, but only values them for what they're worth to him. Damn, Zlata whispered. Your grandmother was savage. I defended him, of course. I laughed bitterly. Said he was just ambitious, that he pushed me because he believed in me. And now he's trying to take control of everything she left you. Zlata's phone buzzed and her eyes widened at the screen. Hold up, you need to see this. She handed me her phone. It was an Instagram post from Connor's business partner, tagged at some upscale restaurant downtown. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Connor with a woman I recognized as his firm's new junior partner. That's his dinner meeting, I said quietly. You okay? Zlata touched my arm. Surprisingly. Yes. I handed back her phone. It's just more evidence. Evidence for what exactly? She raised an eyebrow. What are you planning, Z? I pulled out my laptop. Remember how I've been working late these past months? Yeah? I opened a folder labeled Marketing Research and turned the screen toward her. Inside were hundreds of meticulously organized documents, bank statements, property records, emails I'd recovered from our shared cloud account. Holy shit, Zlata breathed, scrolling through the files. You've been building a case. Connor's not just after my inheritance, I explained. He's been moving money around, setting up shell companies. I think he's been doing this to other people too. How did you even figure all this out? Remember Marcus from the law library? He's been tutoring me. I'm taking the LSATs next month. Zlata's jaw dropped. You're kidding. Nope. And that's not all. I pulled up another document. See this? It's Connor's sister Gillian's signature on some old business documents. The dates don't match what he told me about their falling out. You think she knows something? I think she knows everything. I closed the laptop. And I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Zlata was quiet for a moment, then stood up and walked to her desk. She returned with a business card. You remember my cousin who works in digital forensics? I took the card, hope rising in my chest. You think she'd help? She owes me a favor. And she loves taking down entitled assholes. My phone buzzed, a text from Connor. Meeting running late. Don't wait up. Perfect, I said, showing Zlata the message. That gives me time to get into his home office. Whoa, slow down. Is that safe? I pulled out a small key from my pocket. Found this in his sock drawer last week. It opens his private file cabinet, the one he thinks I don't know about. Zoe, Zlata gripped my hand. Promise me you'll be careful. Men like Connor, they don't like losing control. I know. I squeezed her hand back, but I'm done being controlled. Besides, I smiled grimly, I learned from the best. Evangeline didn't just leave me money. She left me her strength. As I gathered my things to leave, Zlata hugged me tightly. Text me when you're done. And Z, whatever's in that cabinet. I know, I nodded. Document everything. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Connor thought he was weaving a perfect web, but he'd forgotten something crucial. Spiders aren't the only ones who know how to spin traps. I parked in the garage and checked my phone one last time. Another text from Connor. Probably staying at the office tonight. Big presentation tomorrow. Perfect, I whispered, pulling on gloves as I headed inside. Time to see what you've been hiding. Milo's office felt more like a library than a law firm, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the faint smell of old leather. He studied the documents spread across his desk, occasionally adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. This is thorough, he said finally, looking up at me. Remarkably so for someone with no legal training. I'm a quick study. Clearly. He held up one of the papers I'd photographed from Connor's cabinet. Do you understand what this implies? That he's been systematically targeting wealthy women going through emotional crises. I leaned forward. Yes, I do. Not just targeting. Milo's expression darkened. According to these records, your husband has a pattern of manipulating vulnerable women into signing over assets, then using legal pressure to force them into silence. A knock at the door interrupted us. Milo's assistant poked her head in. Ms. Wong is here to see you. My heart skipped. Gillian? Connor's sister stepped into the office, her designer suit a sharp contrast to her tired eyes. Hello, Zoe. I didn't know you were coming, I said, standing. Milo called me. She sat in the chair beside mine. He thought I might have something to add to your case. You knew. The question came out sharper than I intended. All this time you knew what he was doing. Gillian's hands twisted in her lap. I tried to warn you at the wedding. Remember? When I said Connor had a way of making his dreams come true at others' expense? I thought you were just being bitter about the family business split. The split was a cover story, she said quietly. I left because I found out what he did to Maria. Milo pulled out a fresh legal pad. Tell us about Maria. She was our mother's best friend. After Mom died, she helped raise us. Gillian's voice cracked. When her husband died, Connor offered to help manage her estate. Within a year, she had nothing left. When I confronted him, he threatened to destroy my career. But you kept records, Milo prompted. Gillian reached into her briefcase and pulled out a USB drive. I kept everything. My phone buzzed. A text from Zlata. Connor just left his office. Heading your way. He's coming here? Panic rose in my throat. Good, Milo said calmly. Let's see how he handles being caught off guard. 10 minutes later, Connor burst through the door, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. He froze when he saw Gillian. What is this? He demanded. Family reunion, Gillian said coldly. Zoe, baby. Connor switched tactics, his voice softening. Why didn't you tell me you were meeting with lawyers? I could have had our team. Your team? I interrupted. Like the ones helping you file for conservatorship over my estate? His face hardened. That was for your own protection. You've been unstable since Evangeline. Don't say her name. I stood up. Don't you dare use my grandmother to justify what you're doing. What I'm doing is protecting our future. He stepped toward me, but Milo moved between us. Mr. Sherman, I suggest you leave before you say something that could be used against you in court. Connor laughed, but I caught the flicker of fear in his eyes. Court? On what grounds? Fraud, for starters, Milo said, tapping the files on his desk. Financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, misappropriation of funds. You can't prove anything. Actually, Gillian stood up, we can prove everything. Connor's face went white as he stared at the USB drive in her hand. You kept them. After all these years, you kept those files. Unlike you, big brother, I learned from Mum to keep receipts. The mask finally cracked. Connor's handsome features twisted into something ugly. You really want to do this, Zoe? Air our dirty laundry in public? Think about what that will do to your reputation, your career. My reputation? I laughed. I'd rather be known as the woman who stopped you than the fool who helped you destroy more lives. This isn't over, he snarled, heading for the door. Actually, Milo called after him, it is. Expect formal charges to be filed by end of day. And Mr. Sherman? I'd advise against leaving town. After Connor left, I collapsed back into my chair, shaking. You did good. Gillian touched my shoulder. Better than I did. We're not done yet, I said, pulling out my phone to text Zlata. There's someone else you both need to meet, another woman Connor tried to silence. Her name is Olive, and she's been gathering her own evidence. Milo smiled for the first time that day. The more the merrier. Let's build this case until it's absolutely airtight. And Zoe, Gillian added softly, thank you for doing what I couldn't. I thought of Evangeline, of her quiet strength and unwavering principles. Some things are worth fighting for, I said, no matter the cost. The safe deposit box key felt heavy in my palm as I followed the bank manager down the narrow corridor. Connor had kept it hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer, a discovery I'd made during my late-night office raid. Here we are, Mrs. Sherman, the manager said, inserting his key alongside mine. Take all the time you need. Inside the box, I found exactly what I'd feared. Dozens of documents, each representing a different woman's shattered life. Property deeds, transfer agreements, and photographs, all meticulously organised with post-it notes in Connor's precise handwriting. My hands shook as I photographed each document with my phone. Then I saw it, a familiar signature at the bottom of a decade-old contract, Maria's name, just as Gillian had described. Find what you were looking for? I spun around to find a woman standing in the doorway. She was about my age, with short dark hair and knowing eyes. You must be Olive, I said, recognizing her from the photos Zlata had sent. She nodded, stepping into the room. Zlata told me I'd find you here. She glanced at the document spread before me. Brings back memories, doesn't it? You had a box like this too. Different bank. Same setup. Olive moved closer, picking up one of the papers. Connor likes his systems. Everything documented, everything controlled. How did he get to you? I asked softly. My mother was dying. Cancer. Olive's voice was steady, but her hands clenched. Connor offered to help with the medical bills, said he could restructure my debt. By the time I realized what was happening, he owned everything. My house, my savings, even my mother's life insurance policy. I'm so sorry. Don't be, she smiled grimly, because now we're going to make him pay. My phone buzzed. A text from Milo. Meeting set with DA. Bring everything you've found. There's more, Olive said, pulling out her own phone. I've been in contact with 3 other women. They're willing to testify. How many others do you think are out there? Too many. She helped me gather the documents. But that stops now. We left the bank together, stepping into the bright afternoon sun. As we walked to my car, I noticed a familiar figure across the street, Connor watching us from his parked Mercedes. Don't react, Olive muttered. He's trying to intimidate us. It's not working, I said, loud enough for my voice to carry. Connor's engine roared to life and he peeled away from the curb. He's scared, Olive observed. Good. Back at Milo's office, we spread everything out on the conference table. Gillian was already there, along with Zlata and her cousin from digital forensics. This is incredible, Milo said, examining the new evidence. With these documents and the digital trail, we can prove a pattern going back at least 10 years. There's something else, Zlata's cousin spoke up, her laptop screen glowing. I found encrypted emails between Connor and several offshore accounts. He's been moving money, lots of it. Can you trace it? I asked. Already did. She turned the screen toward us. Most of it ends up here, a private account in the Cayman Islands. Gillian leaned forward. That's where he said he lost everything during the family business split. He didn't lose anything, Milo said. He was hiding it. My phone lit up with a text from Connor. We need to talk. Come home. He's getting desperate, Olive warned. That's when men like him are most dangerous. I'm not going anywhere, I said, showing them the text. Let him sweat. Actually, Milo adjusted his glasses thoughtfully, maybe you should meet him. What? Zlata protested. No way. Hear me out, Milo held up a hand. We've got enough for criminal charges, but if we can get him on tape admitting to any of this, I'll do it, I said immediately. Not alone, Olive and Zlata said in unison. Of course not. Milo pulled out a small recording device. We'll have everything set up. One confession from Connor, and this case becomes airtight. I texted Connor back. Okay, give me an hour. Be careful, Gillian squeezed my hand. He's not the brother I grew up with anymore. That person's long gone. As we prepared the recording equipment, I thought about all the women whose lives Connor had destroyed. About Maria, About Olive, about all the others we might never know about. Ready? Milo asked, testing the microphone hidden under my collar. I touched my grandmother's ring for courage. Ready to end this. Remember, Olive said quietly, men like Connor count on our silence. But we're not silent anymore. I nodded, heading for the door. It was time to confront the spider in his web, and this time I was ready for whatever trap he might spin. The house was dark when I arrived, except for Connor's office. Through the window, I could see him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. Zlata's car was parked discreetly down the street, and I knew Olive was watching from another angle. The wire under my blouse felt like it was burning against my skin. You came. Connor opened the door before I could use my key. His usual polished appearance was disheveled, tie loose, sleeves rolled up. You said we needed to talk. I stepped past him into the foyer. I've been trying to reach you all day. He closed the door, the click of the lock making my pulse quicken. Where were you? Does it matter? Of course it matters. He ran a hand through his hair. You're my wife. Everything you do matters to me. Like how Maria mattered to you? Connor froze. What did Gillian tell you? Enough! I moved toward his office, knowing the recording would be clearer there. She told me everything, Connor. About Maria, about the others. You don't understand. He followed me, his voice taking on that familiar, persuasive tone. Maria was unstable after her husband died. I was protecting her from herself, just like I'm trying to protect you. By filing for conservatorship? I turned to face him. By draining my inheritance? I did it for us. He grabbed my shoulders and I fought the urge to pull away. Everything I've done has been for our future. You think your grandmother's money would have lasted? You don't have the skills to manage that kind of wealth. So you managed it for me. Like you managed it for all the others? His fingers dug deeper. What others? The women in the safe deposit box, Connor. I saw the documents. He released me suddenly, stepping back. You went through my private files? Like you went through my emails, my bank statements, my grandmother's will. That was different. He moved to his desk, pulling out a crystal decanter. His hands shook slightly as he poured himself a drink. I'm your husband. I have a right to protect our interests. Our interests? I laughed bitterly. What about the offshore accounts? The money you've been hiding in the Caymans? The glass froze halfway to his lips. How did you find out? The same way I found out about everything else. I stopped being blind, Connor. I started looking. Zoe, baby. His voice softened dangerously. You're making terrible accusations. Think about what you're doing. Think about our life together. I am thinking. For the first time in years, I'm thinking clearly. He drained his glass, then stepped toward me. Remember when we first met? How lost you were after your father died. Who was there for you then? You were, I admitted, waiting to pounce just like you waited for Maria after her husband died, just like you waited for all of them. I helped those women. You destroyed them. I gave them purpose. He slammed his hand on the desk. They were nothing before me, just sad, rich women who couldn't handle their own lives. I gave them direction, security. You stole everything they had. I earned it. The mask finally slipped completely. Do you have any idea how hard it is? Playing the caring friend, the supportive partner, spending months, sometimes years, carefully guiding them toward the right decisions. My heart pounded as he continued, every word being captured by the wire. Those women were weak. They needed someone to take control, just like you need someone to take control now. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But you're different, Zoe. You're special. We can still fix this. Just drop whatever you're planning, and I'll forgive everything. Forgive me? I stepped back. I'm not the one who needs forgiveness. Don't be naive. His eyes hardened. You really think anyone will believe you over me? I have connections, resources. By the time I'm done, you'll look like exactly what you are. An emotionally unstable widow's daughter who couldn't handle her inheritance. Actually, I pulled out my phone and stopped the backup recording I'd been making. I think they'll believe every word. The colour drained from his face. You were recording. The front door burst open and Milo walked in with 2 police officers. Behind them came Gillian, Olive and Zlata. Mr. Sherman, one officer stepped forward. We'd like you to come with us. Connor looked around wildly like a trapped animal. His eyes landed on Gillian. You helped them do this? Your own brother? My brother, she said quietly, died a long time ago. I just didn't want to admit it. As they led Connor away, I felt Olive's hand slip into mine. It's over, she whispered. But looking at Connor's face as he was escorted out, the rage, the calculations still visible behind his eyes, I wasn't so sure. Men like him didn't give up easily. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Connor's lawyer approached the witness stand. I sat between Milo and Olive, watching my husband's carefully constructed facade begin to crack under the weight of evidence. Ms. Elliot, Connor's lawyer addressed Olive, isn't it true that you willingly signed over your assets to my client? I signed under duress, Olive replied steadily, after Mr. Sherman threatened to stop paying my mother's medical bills. Threats you conveniently have no proof of. Objection, Milo stood. The prosecution has submitted recorded conversations. Sustained, the judge interrupted. Connor sat at the defense table, still immaculate in his tailored suit, but his jaw twitched, a tell I'd learned to recognize over the years. He was furious. Your Honor, Connor's lawyer pivoted. I'd like to call Zoe Sherman to the stand. My heart raced as I took the oath. Connor's eyes never left me as I sat down. Mrs. Sherman, how would you describe your emotional state after your grandmother's death? I was grieving, I said carefully, but I was not unstable. Yet you began acting erratically, staying out late, keeping secrets from your husband, accessing private files without permission. I was gathering evidence of fraud. Or perhaps, he smiled coldly, you were having an affair. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Milo jumped to his feet. Objection! Relevance! Goes to the witness's credibility, Your Honor? I'll allow it, but tread carefully. No, I said firmly. I was not having an affair. I was studying law. Connor's lawyer paused. Studying law? Yes. I pulled out my LSAT results from the folder in front of me. I passed the LSAT last month. I have witnesses who can verify my study schedule, including the law librarian and my tutor. So you admit to deceiving your husband. I admit to protecting myself from him. I turned to face the jury, just like I'm doing now. Mrs. Sherman, let me ask you something, I interrupted. Have you seen the photos from Connor's safe deposit box? The ones where he documented each woman's vulnerable state before targeting them? Connor's lawyer paled slightly. Your Honor, because I have, I continued. I've seen every note he made, every strategy he planned, how he waited for the right moment of grief or crisis, how he positioned himself as a savior before destroying their lives. Objection! Sustained. Mrs. Sherman, please respond only to the questions asked. I nodded, but the damage was done. I could see it in the jury's faces. They'd heard the truth in my words. No further questions, Connor's lawyer muttered. During the recess, Gillian grabbed my arm. Maria's here. I turned to see an elegant older woman entering the courtroom. Connor saw her too. For the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. All rise, the bailiff called as proceedings resumed. Maria's testimony was devastating in its simplicity. She described Connor's manipulation with the clarity of someone who'd had years to process their trauma. When she finished, even Connor's lawyer seemed deflated. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. Connor leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, who shook his head firmly. The mask finally cracked completely. Connor stood up. I want to address the court. Mr. Sherman, the judge warned, I advise you to consult with your counsel. These women needed me. Connor's voice echoed through the courtroom. They were lost, helpless. I gave them purpose, direction. Without me, they would have squandered everything. Mr. Sherman, sit down. Tell them, Zoe. He turned to me, eyes wild. Tell them how I saved you after your father died, how I built you up, made you strong. You didn't make me strong, Connor. I met his gaze steadily. You tried to make me weak, but I had someone who taught me real strength. I touched my grandmother's ring, and she taught me to recognize men like you. Order! The judge's gavel cracked through the air. Mr. Sherman, one more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. Connor slumped back into his chair, the fight draining from him as he finally realized he'd lost control not just of me, but of himself. As the jury filed out for deliberation, Olive squeezed my hand. Whatever happens now, you've already won. We've all won, I corrected her, looking around at the women Connor had tried to silence, Maria, chatting quietly with Gillian, the others who'd come forward, supporting each other in the gallery. Milo adjusted his glasses with a slight smile. The jury won't be long, not after that performance. He was right. Within 2 hours, they returned with their verdict. And as the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, I watched the last remnants of Connor's carefully constructed world crumble to dust. 15 years, Zlata whistled, sliding a coffee across the courthouse cafeteria table to me. Plus full restitution to all victims. That's what I call karma. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, still processing the judge's sentencing from an hour ago. Did you see his face when they led him away? You mean when he tried to give that speech about being misunderstood? Olive sat down with us, dropping a stack of newspapers on the table. Classic narcissist to the end. The headlines screamed across the front pages. Financial predator sentenced. Justice for wealthy women targeted in long-running scheme. Prominent businessman's double life exposed. They want to interview you, Gillian said, joining our table. All the major networks. Your story's gone viral. Our story, I corrected her. We did this together. The cafeteria doors burst open and Maria hurried in, clutching her phone. You need to see this. Now. She pulled up a video, Connor being led to the prison transport. He stopped, turned to the cameras, and started speaking. Zoe thinks she's won, his voice crackled through the phone's speaker, but she forgets. I know everything about her. Every secret, every weakness. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Empty threats. Milo appeared behind us, straightening his tie. He's just trying to maintain some illusion of control. I don't know, Gillian frowned. I've seen that look before, right before he destroyed my career. Let him try, I said, standing up. I'm done being afraid of him. Speaking of not being afraid, Olive pulled out a folder, we need to talk about the foundation. After Connor's arrest, we discovered just how extensive his network of financial manipulation had been. Dozens of women across 3 states, all targeted during vulnerable moments in their lives. The paperwork's ready, Milo said. Once the restitution payments start coming in, we can launch immediately. The Evangeline Morrison Foundation for Financial Empowerment, Zlata read from the documents. Your grandmother would be proud. We've already got 5 women who want to share their stories, Maria added, and 20 more who've reached out for help. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. My heart stopped when I opened it. You think a foundation can protect them? I made you, Zoe. I can unmake you just as easily. Connor, Olive asked, seeing my expression. I showed them the message. That's impossible, Milo frowned. He shouldn't have phone access yet. He's got someone helping him, Gillian said quietly. He always does. Another text came through. Check your email, now. I pulled up my inbox and felt the blood drain from my face. There was an email from Connor's old account sent to every major news outlet in the city. The subject line, The Real Zoe Sherman, a story of manipulation and lies. Open it, Milo instructed, already dialing his phone. The email contained documents, old therapy records from after my father's death, private journal entries, photos taken without my knowledge, all carefully selected and annotated to paint me as unstable, manipulative, dangerous. This is good, Olive said suddenly. Good? Zlata stared at her. How is this good? Because he's desperate, Olive smiled grimly, and desperate men make mistakes. She was right. Within an hour, Milo's team had traced the emails and texts to a private investigator Connor had on retainer. By evening, the PI was in custody, rolling over on Connor to save himself. We found his whole network, Milo announced, hanging up his phone. Everyone he paid to help him over the years. They're all talking now. Why? I asked. Why would they turn on him so quickly? Because you showed them something Connor never understood, Maria said softly. The power of women supporting women. As if to prove her point, my phone started buzzing with messages, not from Connor this time, but from women across the country. Women who'd seen the news, who recognized their own stories in ours, who wanted to help. This is bigger than Connor now, Gillian said, scrolling through the messages. This is about changing the system that enabled him. Then let's change it. I stood up, addressing our growing circle of survivors and supporters. Connor thought he could silence us by exposing our vulnerabilities. But our vulnerability is our strength. Our stories are our power. The foundation launches next week, Olive reminded everyone. We start with education, teaching women to recognize the signs, protect their assets, trust their instincts. And we'll be there, Maria gestured to herself and the other survivors, to show them they're not alone. My phone buzzed one last time, another message from Connor's network, but this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt pity. Because while he sat in his cell, plotting revenge, we were building something he could never understand. A community of women who refused to be victims, who turned their pain into purpose, their trauma into triumph. Ready to make some real change? Zlata asked, gathering her things. I touched my grandmother's ring, feeling her strength flow through me. More than ready. Let's get to work. Welcome to the Evangeline Morrison Foundation, I smiled at the packed auditorium. I see a lot of familiar faces here today and many new ones. The foundation's headquarters buzzed with energy. Women of all ages filled every seat, their expressions a mix of hope and determination. In the front row, Olive, Zlata and Maria sat with our newest board members. When my grandmother told me to be careful of men who collect people like art, I didn't understand what she meant, I continued. Now I do. And more importantly, I understand how to stop them. The doors at the back of the auditorium opened, and Gillian slipped in with Milo. They'd just come from the final hearing, the one that would determine what happened to Connor's hidden assets. Gillian gave me a subtle thumbs up. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Today, we're not just launching new programs, I announced. Thanks to this morning's court decision, we're receiving full control of all recovered assets from Connor's schemes. That's over $12 million that will go directly to helping women protect themselves from financial predators. Applause erupted through the room. I caught sight of a reporter frantically typing on her phone. Tomorrow's headlines already taking shape. But money isn't enough, I held up my hand. We need education, support, community. That's why I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Many of you know her story. It was her courage that helped break this case open. Please welcome Olive Elliott. As Olive took the podium, I joined the others in the front row. Maria squeezed my hand. Have you seen the latest numbers? She whispered, showing me her tablet. Over 300 women have come forward since we launched the website. We've already helped 30 of them recover their assets. And identified 6 more predators operating with Connor's playbook, Zlata added quietly. On stage, Olive was describing the warning signs she'd missed. The audience hung on every word, many nodding in recognition. My phone vibrated. A message from the prison warden. I'd been expecting this. Connor's requesting a meeting. I showed Milo the message. Don't give him the satisfaction, he advised. Actually, I smiled. I think I will. The next day, I sat across from Connor in the prison visiting room. His orange jumpsuit was a far cry from his designer suits, but his eyes still held that calculating gleam. You look well, he said smoothly. Success suits you. What do you want, Connor? Can't a man want to see his wife? Ex-wife, I corrected. The divorce was finalized last week. His jaw tightened. I've been watching the news. Your little foundation is making quite a splash. That bothers you, doesn't it? That we're helping women recognize men like you before it's too late? Men like me. He leaned forward. I made those women stronger, just like I made you stronger. No, Connor. You tried to make us weaker, but you failed. Did I? His smile turned cruel. Look at you now, successful, powerful, confident. Everything I pushed you to be. Everything my grandmother knew I could be. I stood up. You were just the obstacle I had to overcome to get there. Sit down, he snapped. I'm not finished. But I am. I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. These are the latest numbers from our foundation. 300 women coming forward. 6 more predators exposed. Millions in assets recovered. His hands shook as he opened the folder. Your playbook? I continued. We're teaching women how to recognize it. Your network? They've all turned on you. Your hidden accounts? They're funding our programs now. You can't? I already have. I walked to the door, then turned back. You know what the irony is, Connor? You actually did make me stronger, just not the way you intended. This isn't over, he called after me. You'll see. It was over the moment you underestimated us. I cut him off. All of us. Outside, Olive was waiting in her car. How'd it go? Exactly as expected, I smiled. He still thinks he's in control. Meanwhile, we just got another call. She started the engine. A woman in Seattle recognized her financial advisor's tactics from our website. She's ready to talk. Then let's go hear her story. As we drove to the foundation, I thought about Evangeline, about how she'd seen through Connor from the start, about how she'd left me not just her money, but her wisdom, her strength, her legacy. You okay? Olive asked. Better than okay, I replied, watching the foundation's building come into view. Its windows glowed with warmth and purpose, a beacon for women seeking help and hope. Inside, I knew Maria would be counseling new clients. Zlata would be tracking financial patterns. Gillian would be sharing her brother's tactics to help others avoid the same traps. And somewhere out there, more women were finding their strength, their voice, their power. Connor had tried to build an empire of control and fear. Instead, he'd inadvertently helped create something far more powerful. A community of survivors turned warriors, turning their pain into purpose, their scars into shields for others. That was the real victory, and it was just the beginning.